So one of my favorite parts, which is lease structure 101. Okay, so the lease for a commercial property is very important because the lease will make or break the commercial property. You have a good lease in place with good tenant, with good rental structures, good rent reviews, your property is going to be worth more. If you have poor tenant in place, you have bad rent, you have bad, rental review structures, your property is going to be worth less. So it's very important to pay attention to some of the key clauses in the lease when you're structuring the lease or when you're negotiating the lease with a prospective tenant. Okay, so the first one obviously is the rent reviews. Okay, so let me show you two scenarios and demonstrate why rent reviews are so important. So let's say in scenario one, you've negotiated a new lease with a tenant. The starting rent is going to be $100,000 per year. You've agreed to a 5-year lease term with a rent review, a fixed review of 2.5%. Okay, so year one's 100,000, year two is 102,500, et cetera, et cetera. So over the 5-year lease term, you will have collected a total of $525,633. And the passing rent in year 5 will be $110,381. Okay, pretty straightforward. Now, how does that affect the value of your property? So let's say the cap rate of the property is 5%. At the end of 5 years, your property is going to be worth somewhere around $2.2 million because it's 5%. So it's because it's a passing rate, 110,000 divided by 5%. So your property should be valued at around $2,207,000. Okay, so that's scenario one. Scenario two, everything is the same except the rent review is now 4%. Okay, so it's only 1.5%, difference, right? But it could have a really profound effect. Okay, and let me show you exactly what I mean. So just by increasing the rent review by 1.5% per annum, you'll be receiving a total of $541,632 over the lease term. The passing rent at year 5 will be $116,986. And if you apply the same cap rate on the property will be valued at $2,339,720. So in scenario 2, over the 5-year term, you would receive an extra $16,000 in rent and an extra $132,000 in property value. You see the profound effect it has just by adjusting the rent review by a small magnitude of 1.5%. You've affected over 6% of your profits. Okay, or not profits, sorry, of your property value, which is huge. So don't be afraid to negotiate a little bit harder on the rental reviews. Okay. The next thing that is very important to understand is the rental incentive structure. Okay, again, I'm going to show you two scenarios and where a lot of property investors make a mistake. Okay, so let's say you're a landlord, your property is vacant, and you've put the property on the market, and the asking rent is $100,000 per annum. Tenant comes along, really likes the property, starts negotiating, and you've agreed to give the tenant a 20% discount on the rent. So the agreed rent now becomes $80,000. Okay, they've agreed to 5-year lease term and a 4% fixed annual rent review. So your income becomes $80,000 in year 1, $83,200 in year 2, and all the way to year 3. So the total rent received will be $433,306. However, the passing rent in year 5 will be $93,589. So if you apply a 5% cap rate on the property, your property will be only worth $1,871,000. Okay, because you've given the tenant a 20% discount on the rent. If we look at scenario 2, same parameters, except the only difference is instead of giving them a 20% discount on the rent, we're giving the tenant a 20% incentive in the form of a 12-month rent-free period. So if we look at this across the board, then in year 1, because you're offering a 12-month rent-free period, is you're receiving 0 rent, or you can structure the rent incentive differently. Maybe you can spread the rent-free period across 2 years or 3 years. So maybe in year 1, year 2, you're receiving half rent. Like, it doesn't matter how you structure it. But the point of the story is the passing rent in year 5 is $116,962, and the property value using the same cap rate, same property, same everything, is worth $2,339,000. So there's over $500,000 difference in property value. So a lot of property investors shoot themselves in the foot, because rather than offering them an incentive, they're offering them a discount in rent. Okay, so it's very important that you know how to structure the incentives properly, particularly when you're valuing the property. The valuer is always going to look at the passing rent. Okay, in some cases, obviously, they'll factor in the rental incentives if there's any outstanding rental incentives. But assuming there's no outstanding rental incentive, the valuer would just look at what the passing rent is. And if you're offering them a straight up for 20% discount, it's going to have a profound effect on your property value. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier in the masterclass, rental incentives have a direct impact on your property value. So really smart investors know how to use incentives well to increase their property value. Oh, as a side note, if you're looking at buying a property, watch out for any unpaid incentives that's owing to the tenant. Okay, so for example, the vendor might have agreed to a 6-month rent-free period to the tenant, and you're looking at purchasing the property just 2 months into the new lease. That means there are 4 months of rent-free remaining that's owing to the tenant. Okay, so if you're not careful and you've just bought the property without knowing this, then you're going to be liable for the 4 months of unpaid incentives owing to the tenant. Now, in most cases, particularly with what I do, we do our due diligence very, very carefully. So we'll be able to pick up on some of these things. So what we usually do is we organize a rebate at settlement of whatever the unpaid incentive is owing to the tenant, and that amount is rebated back to the purchaser. Option terms is another thing that occurs very often in leases. And as I mentioned before, options gives the tenant the right to extend their lease term. The landlord has no control over whether the tenant exercises the option or not. So therefore, there is actually no advantage for the landlord to grant any options. So let's say if you were planning on redeveloping the property, but you've locked into a 3 + 3 + 3 year lease term, then you're at the mercy of the tenant. Okay, so it has no advantages to the landlord by offering an option term. However, practically speaking, we do understand that as part of negotiations, you may have to look at offering an option term to a prospective tenant. Okay, so sometimes you may offer an option. However, you want to make sure that you structure an appropriate market review and option. And also, as a reminder, when you're looking at properties that already has a tenant with option terms, a 3 + 3 + 3 year lease term does not mean a 9-year lease. Okay. Security, obviously, when you're leasing out the property, you want some sort of bond, some sort of security in case the tenant moves out, goes bust, or he's not fulfilling his obligation in the lease. Then you want some sort of leasing security. Beg your pardon. So here are some of the common lease securities. So bank guarantee is basically a certificate issued by a bank that guarantees a certain amount. So bank guarantee is actually pretty good for a number of reasons. One is pretty much as good as gold, but assuming the issuing bank is a reputable bank and not some dodgy bank. So you can usually claim the bank guarantee without a lot of hassle. And the advantage for the tenant is that rather than handing over cash to the landlord in the event of disappearing with it, they can actually put the money in the bank because the bank would need some sort of security. And usually they'll put it into a long-term deposit and earn some interest on the money. The other one is cash bond. Obviously, that's pretty straightforward. It's just whatever the bond is paid in cash to the owner. And there's also personal guarantees as well. So I see a lot of investors insisting on having a personal guarantee. In some cases, that's good, but in my opinion, in most cases, it's pretty useless. Particularly if you're looking at a low rental amount. So you're looking at leases that are worth maybe $30,000-$40,000 a year. It's probably going to cost you that amount in legal fees just to recover any personal guarantee. And if the lease amount is huge, $300,000, $400,000 a year, again, there's no point in trying to recover personal guarantee because the director or the person who's guaranteeing it might not have that sort of amount of wealth or asset equivalent to that. And just the process of getting the personal guarantee is also really lengthy and drawn out and complicated. So in my opinion, personal guarantees are not really practical, but hey, it's better to have it than not. Okay. The industry standard for security is usually between 3 to 6 months of the gross rent, and ideally the amount of security that you have is enough to cover the cost of make good if the tenant goes bust and or reletting. Okay, so if the tenant goes away, you want enough money to fix up the place and to find a new tenant. Sublease or assignment. So what is that, and why is it common in the lease? So a sublease allows the tenant to sublease part or all of his premises to a subtenant with the landlord's reasonable approval. It's worth noting that under a sublease arrangement, the first tenant is still fully responsible for all the obligations under the lease. So, for example, let's say with residential property, let's say you have flatmates. What typically happens is you have one person that signs the lease with the landlord, and then you will then sublease your spare bedrooms to your flatmate, and you collect their rent, and then you just pay the landlord rent. So same sort of thing here. But why would it occur in a commercial property? Well, there's a number of reasons. So, for example, let's say the tenant has restructured their business. They don't need all that office space or that industrial space anymore. They can then sublease part of it to another company and receive some sort of income from that. Or another really good example are co-working businesses, co-working space, like WeWork or SurfCobb. Their entire business model is built upon renting a large office premises, putting in the infrastructure and offices and desk, meeting room, and then subleasing it into smaller tenancies and receiving a premium on top of it. And so what's the difference between assignment and sublease? An assignment allows the tenant to assign the lease and all of its obligations to a new tenant, or otherwise known as the assignee. So what are the pros and cons of an assignment? Well, let's say the first tenant is a tenant of good quality. Ideally, as a landlord, you want to replace them with a tenant of equal or better quality. But sometimes then that's not the case. Now, usually in all these commercial leases, assignments are subject to the landlord's approval. Okay. And why would a company look at assigning the lease? Well, there's a number of reasons. One example will be because the business has been sold. Business has been sold, and they don't need the space anymore, and they want to sublease it so that they get rid of their obligations. Or another reason is the business have outgrown the space, so they move to different premises and they don't want to let go of the obligations, on this particular lease. Okay, so the number of reasons why a tenant will want to assign the lease.